Today I will be talking to you about the liberation theology movement. I'll give a brief global history of the movement, as well as an example of it in El Salvador. In 1962, Pope John XXIII decided to call the Vatican II Council. He was concerned that the Church wasn't reaching youth and perhaps wasn't changing with the times, and was becoming antiquated and in danger of losing its relevance in the world. One of the major reasons he cited for this was that the Church was a mirror church, in that churches from around the world were expected to copy exactly how the Vatican ran masses and try to recreate the same thing in their own communities. This included having the Latin language being spoken and the other various rituals that were considered part of the High Mass. One of the outcomes of Vatican II was to transform the mirror church into a source church, meaning that communities from around the world would still refer to the Vatican for reference and for structure in giving their masses, but were free to make other decisions that were culturally relevant and appropriate for their own societies. For example, being able to say Mass in their own cultural language. While this was exciting for most of the world, Gustavo Gutierrez, a theologian in Peru, noted that the significant breaks in the history of the Church and the history of Latin America remained unspoken when the Vatican II was taking place. With this changing of times that the Vatican II was urging, there is a liberation theology that Gustavo developed in an attempt to reconcile this break in the history of the Church and the history of Latin America. So, from his home in Lima, Peru, he started to develop his idea of what liberation theology was. Liberation theology for Gustavo was really a new language. In the past, God was very much considered someone of the individual. We would say our own prayers in a very isolated kind of sense. We would talk about God being high above us and someone that would look down and listen to our prayers, which are individually given. Gustavo wanted to change that and to have the idea that God is actually part of the community, that our communal ties are so important that we can see God in the face of others, and that any decisions that we make and prayers that we make must be done in context of the community and in a deep appreciation and respect of our neighbors. Liberation theology also considers the Bible to be driven by liberation themes. It references Exodus, with Moses freeing the slaves. It talks about Jesus' healing miracles, such as giving sight to the blind or allowing the lame to walk again, and the freeing feelings that come with that. It talks about the book of prophets, which cites the importance of the poor and the lowly, and it also cites the Beatitudes, talking about those who are blessed for being poor in spirit, and those who suffer. And finally, liberation theology really tries to cite God's presence as being inseparable from concrete suffering. It tackles a question that others hadn't tackled before, saying, how can God be present and love those who deeply suffer, who are victims of violence, or who seem to have no way of finding hope and happiness in the world? Where is God for these people? For this, liberation theology came up with the idea of a God as a suffering God, a God who walks with the poor, a God who feels the pain of the poor, and a God who would cry each tear with the poor. This became something called a preferential option for the poor, being that those who are poor, those who are suffered, could consider God not as someone far away or something far away that would maybe hear their prayers and act on them, but rather a God that was with them in every moment and was present to their reflection and also present to their need and urging to go into communal action in order to improve the societal structures that would cause the suffering in the first place. This was particularly true in El Salvador. John Sobrino, a famous theologian who is a Salvadoran, advanced much of the writings and collaborated closely with John Sobrino in the context of liberation theology. El Salvador is historically a place of oppression. Even before its ferocious civil war from 1980 to 1992, there's a long history of division and of violence and brutality, particularly of the rich and the military, to the poor, those who lived in lower economic regions, those were farmers, those who lived on $1 a day or less. Now, amongst these people, priests would go out and give masses, or would stay in the city and give masses, and they would say, those of you who are poor, don't worry. Your suffering now will be rewarded later in the kingdom of heaven. They would cite the Beatitudes, saying, blessed are they, the poor in spirit, they will inherit the earth, saying that you suffer now, But don't worry, in the future, you'll actually be rewarded richly because of your suffering now. Now, this didn't really work for most people because they said, okay, well, you say this, yet we're still encountering violent repression. Our families are hungry. We don't have resources for food, or sometimes for shelter, or for just and fair work. We don't have it. We aren't respected. We're ignored. This is truly suffering, and we want justice now. We don't want to wait until we're dead with this promise by the priest saying that you'll be rewarded later. It didn't make sense to people to say that we should be putting up with suffering while we watch other people live off of our suffering richly. Now, as this talk was spreading, especially with an idea of God being amongst the poor and God urging people to love one another, to see the face of God in one another, and to let their liberation be linked to the liberation of others, there were accusations of socialism that began to occur. The idea of saying, well, you want to take the wealth of the rich and distribute it amongst the poor, this is communism. And now some people in El Salvador, particularly when I went there to visit, would say we weren't actually socialists, we just didn't want our neighbors to be hungry. When we talked about sharing with others, we had no idea what Marxism was or who Karl Marx was. We didn't know what communism was. We just were tired of seeing our friends suffer, and we wanted to see them get better. So if they didn't have anything and we did, we shared with them what we had. We broke bread with them as Jesus broke bread. As this talk was going on, the church decided to appoint Oscar Romero as Archbishop in 1977. He was considered to be a safe appointment. He was someone that they knew would maintain the status quo. He was very reluctant to do anything that would cause any change or really ruffle any feathers. They saw him as kind of the perfect appointment, especially when there was some talk about liberation theology and some stirring amongst the poorer communities. And Oscar Romero really was true to that at the beginning, even with urging from his friends to take a look at the injustices that were happening, to look at the killing that the military was doing, to look at some of these extreme actions of oppression. He still decided to stay hands-off and to not take action. However, that all changed when later in the year, in 1977, one of his best friends, Rutilio Grande, was killed by the military in a brutal kind of way. When Oscar Romero saw this and saw what the military was capable of, and when he really felt the kind of loss and the sting that the violence had given, he realized that he needed to act out against the violence. So he decided to actually adopt liberation theology and to spread themes of anti-violence for the military. He became famous for giving these homilies, which the whole country listened to over radio, where he would directly target or speak to the military saying, I ask you to stop killing. I ask you to release the prisoners. And he spoke about justice in a way that the rich felt threatened. He talked about the injustices that were present, such as a lack of food, a lack of shelter, a lack of a right to work. And he demanded that these changes be made in the context of theology, saying that we must find God in one another, and we must treat one another with deep respect and with love. With this, liberation theology was understood with several main components. One of the main ones was its rejection of violence. It spoke of love constantly and truly asks us to see God in our neighbors and to try to reach out in ways of solidarity and compassion to one another. It also issues frequent statements of justice, saying how important it is that all people have a right to the things that are present in Catholic social teaching, and that those rights be upheld, no matter who the person is. It also is very clear to treat God as a God of the community, and less so as the God as the individual. It gets away from that idea of saying that God is far away, and that we'll see God when we go to heaven, and that we need to suffer now on earth so that we can get our reward in heaven. It's by saying, no, God is here in the community with us right now. God is encouraging us to love one another, and God is encouraging us to make the changes we need in order to bring more justice for more people. Finally, it talks about the idea of urgency, saying, again, we can't wait until death for ourselves to feel that that retribution has been given. We needed to do this now. There is suffering here now, and there is a need for action right now. Now, there are obviously criticisms against this. I already talked about the socialist concerns that were particularly present amongst the rich. There's also criticism that liberation theology misinterpreted certain parts of the Bible. For example, the Beatitudes, where it says, "Blessed are they, the poor in spirit; they shall inherit the earth." Some would argue that that actually did refer to the poor in spirit when they died; they would inherit the earth, or those who suffer and mourn now when they died, they would be given joy. Uh, and then more recently, Cardinal Ratzinger has several reservations about liberation theology in general. He cited the idea that it was perhaps socialist themes in certain ways, and he also talked about theological misinterpretations, including the Beatitudes, amongst others. However, to his credit, he did say that there were parts of it that he found important and relevant, such as the talk about justice and the talk about nonviolence. And he did cite the idea of the arms race and the idea of nuclear proliferation as things that liberation theology spoke out against and things that were important to consider in our current society. And currently, it's been interesting to see how Pope Francis has responded to liberation theology. News articles in the past have reported him as being uncomfortable with liberation theology in the past when he lived in Argentina. Most recently, in 2013, he actually met with Gustavo Gutierrez, the founder of liberation theology. The outcome isn't very well known. However, some people are suggesting that this may be the start of more dialogue between the Vatican and Gustavo and the other major liberation theologians about the implications of liberation theology and how it may affect our world. Having said that, there still is some division in liberation theology, particularly in Latin America. In the churches in the main cities, the people in churches in which wealthy people attend or affluent people attend, there still is a theology that talks about God as about the personal relationship with God. There isn't really much talk about the community relationship with God. You'll see amongst the poorer communities, certainly there's more theme about liberation theology. Even if people don't know what the liberation theology definition is, they'll still talk about it in their interactions during church or elsewhere in the community. And this is very similar also in Lima, Peru. In some of the larger churches, music with liberation theology themes is actually banned. One of the most notable places is at the cathedral in downtown Lima, but the music is widely used in the poorer communities, where people find more ways to connect with the text and more desire to actually reflect on it. So there's an issue in which the liberation theologians, or the liberation people that buy into liberation theology, and those who don't buy into it, there doesn't appear to be much dialogue actually taking place between the two parties. And one of the things that liberation theologians have suggested, and which I've heard from people that I've talked to in these countries, is that until that dialogue actually happens, there can be no way for it to move forward. But there will still be these two parties that are divided amongst each other. So one of the goals moving forward is to really think, how can these parties interact with each other, and how can there be greater discussion about what parts of liberation theology are compatible with each group, which parts are not compatible, and how can there be some sort of greater understanding and greater development of community. That kind of discussion was hinted at again with the meeting between Gustavo Gutierrez and with Pope Francis, but we'll have to see if that continues and in what ways it continues to develop.